Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to hear me talk about self-esteem and fashion with what I hoped was quite an alluring title, Does My Self-Esteem Look Big in This? I was asked to think about a subject that would work well for the fashion industry, and it really did capture my attention that certainly for the past 2 years there's been a lot of controversy about whether the fashion industry is to blame for promoting difficult and unattainable images for young girls or for vulnerable people in general. And I really wanted to counter that and to see whether we could look at it in a slightly more holistic way, really. And so really the idea of the speech is to get you to think about what your engagement is with this industry that you have some connection with, perhaps in your profession, or perhaps it's something that you've always been very interested in. The idea of self-esteem and identity is very well known, but anyone who doubts whether fashion can alter your mood only really has to think about the stiletto, the way in which when a woman slips into a stiletto, lots of things happen. Things happen physiologically. Her boobs get thrust out a little bit more, maybe her bottom sticks out a bit more, the silhouette is elongated. She might have to actually alter the way that she walks, maybe with a bit more of a wiggle, but everything is accentuated on the feminine. And that's actually just from putting the shoe on. Internally, the person can also feel a little bit more confident about their posture, their height, the fact that maybe these shoes go with the outfit that she's wearing. She feels a little bit more together, a little bit more groomed. And that's a kind of internal response. And what we know from studies is that that kind of footwear can make overall a woman feel just that little bit more confident before going to a party, confident before going to an interview, confident before making some very crucial pitch in their work environment, just maybe gives them that little bit of an edge. So again, that's just happening because somebody's just put on a pair of shoes. So there's a lot that can be said about fashion and the way that it can influence how you feel about yourself. And if it can affect how you feel about yourself, then the chances are it's going to affect how other people view you. If you give off this aura of confidence, the people who are interacting with you or engaging with you are going to have that experience too. They might start to think about you in a slightly different way. They might see you as a little bit more confident. They didn't have that view of you before, and now suddenly their response to you changes just because of what you're wearing. And that's partly because clothes and fashion in particular, they're part of a fantasy world. They're part of a playful part of our psyche that's very creative. It allows us to be creative. It isn't just about allowing people who work in the industry to be creative, but it's about allowing consumers to be creative too. And this is actually linked very much to our early childhood. We're incredibly imitative creatures. It's pretty much how we learn absolutely everything we do, from how to eat, whether we smile, and sooner or later we start to notice that, mummy wears this kind of clothing and daddy wears that kind of clothing, and we start to want to mimic it. Quite a lot of little girls raid their mummy's wardrobes. They slip into high heels, splodge on a bit of lipstick, and it kind of looks comical, but it's a very essential form of play and experimentation for small children. And then what we see as it gets a little bit older, say 5, 6, 7, 8, is the way in which children can start to pretend to be other people. This could be because, for example, they might learn about things at school. They might learn about dinosaurs, they might learn about astronauts, spacemen, learn about nurses, they learn about what jobs are and what names go with jobs. And they start to perhaps go to fancy dress parties dressed as a cowboy, a spaceman, a nurse, or something like that, a fairy. And what they will begin to experience, because it's actually happening to them, is that they feel a bit different. They feel a bit different wearing those clothes. Sometimes they might not like what they wear. They don't want to be the cowboy or the little girl that's always shoehorned into being a fairy because she wants to be a car mechanic. It's, one of those moments where children can start to really, not necessarily with the vocabulary, but they can begin to feel what it feels like to play around with their own identity. And in a way, that's what clothes allow us to do. Oh, I think I have to sing the next bit. No? Maybe not. This then progresses to the next stage, which is in adolescence, where you start to focus much more outside your family and onto other objects that start to inspire you. These could be pop stars, they could be, that's supposed to be a pop star, obviously, slightly old-fashioned one. That's where the music comes from. Or it could be a sporting hero, it could be an actor, could be a scientist that they've heard about, someone that they can start to look to and perhaps start to try and emulate, at least on the outside. And that can often involve changing hairstyle, changing the clothes that you wear, the colours that you prefer. But again, it's all about changing your identity, because wrapped up in your identity is that sense of who you are and whether you're worthy. How do people relate to you? Do they dismiss what you look like, or do they dismiss your choices, or are they endorsing them? Are they supporting them? And that can sometimes be the first step in trying to work out whether you feel valued, whether you value yourself. I guess what I'm saying is that it's actually an incredibly powerful process. I doubt there's anyone in this room who hasn't actually, as a younger person, younger version of themselves, gone through some aspect of that experimentation process. And the reason why fashion and clothes become so powerful is because I feel like I ought to have this amazing momentum. So let's hope I eventually get there. You could argue that the desire to have attractive clothes, or clothes that represent how we see ourselves, has an incredibly long pedigree, because even in the sort of ancient civilizations, what we notice, particularly from burial sites that have a lot of accessories and things that are left in the burial sites, that the impulse to adorn ourselves has been going along for centuries. It's that sense in which we want to perhaps stand out or make ourselves more alluring. Thank you very much. But you could understand perhaps why, let's be quite sort of stereotypical about this. You could understand why a woman might want to make herself stand out in order to, let's say, attract the best specimen in the tribe and mate with them and perpetuate her genes. But where does that fit into fashion? Because notwithstanding the fact that there are actually an awful lot of men in this audience, the average man in the street doesn't really understand female fashion at all, and probably hasn't understood it for centuries, and therefore if a woman is dressed very elegantly or on a complete on-trend, the man probably won't actually notice that. So where does that actually get you if you're a woman or even a man trying to buy into this concept of fashion? And the reason why fashion and clothing, fashionable clothing, is so powerful is because it helps us bond with our tribe. It helps us form an identity of shared choices that can actually make us feel incredibly safe and incredibly secure. Again, I'm kind of looking at it from quite a subliminal, quite an unconscious level. I'm a Freudian psychotherapist, so you'd kind of expect me to focus on Freud's obsession with the unconscious, but we connect with people on a very simplistic level, who either look like us, or who sound like us, or who share our values. And on a pre-verbal level, pretty much all you're left with is what they look like. And fast forward that over the centuries, it does come down to the things that we wear. So you've got a lady here, she's working in some kind of city professional environment. Everyone in that photo is in a suit, whether they're male, female. You don't know what their sexual orientation is, you don't know anything about them, but you can just tell that somehow they belong together, and they know that too. That's why they're dressed the way they are. And it's quite hard to actually break out of that behaviour, because you run the risk of being ejected from the group, either very concretely or on a much more unconscious level. You might be sent to Coventry. People don't want to talk to you because you've got the wrong colour shoes. So the acceptance of the tribe is incredibly important for our psyche. The way that in a way gets processed happens quite early on. If you think about where we're located at the moment, just off Oxford Street, you've got Debenhams, you've got Selfridges. On a Saturday, there are groups of boys and girls trawling around the fashion floors. They're trying on clothes, they're sharing experiences with each other, they're bonding as a tribe. Fashion provides an outlet for people to start the bonding experience. So it doesn't even have to matter about what you wear. It's just an incredibly important glue that keeps you connected to your tribe. But having said that, ironically, at the same time as wanting to fit in, we have a bit of an urge to stand out. And that goes back to another biological imperative, which is that ultimately you are going to want to mate with the most perfect specimen of the species, and therefore you have to become a bit more distinctive. And I chose this photo. It's not a particularly brilliant photo, but it's just really to show you that somehow you know that they're all linked. They kind of have chosen clothes, chosen a style, chosen a sartorial language that they all understand. And yet at the same time, they have personalised it. So you've got the girl who has decided that her best asset is her flat tummy or her tummy stud, and she's going to make sure that that gets shown. Whereas this one quite likes her legs, doesn't mind showing them off, shorter the skirt the better. She's comfortable with that part of her body, and she's going to show that. This guy, yeah, I'm going to be casual, but I'm going to wear a jacket as well. That I feel safer. Maybe he's hiding behind the jacket, or maybe he thinks it makes him look slightly older or slightly more grown up. Somehow, this girl, I always think, she kind of wants you to focus on her hair. There's something more exciting there about her hair. That's her fashion statement, if you like. Whereas the clothes, there's a part of me, well actually it's quite similar to what I'm wearing, there's a part of me that thinks that she's sort of the least drawing attention to herself in terms of what she's actually wearing. But there are all sorts of coded messages that are taking place on a daily basis when we choose what it is we're going to wear. And it's partly about fitting in, and it's partly about standing out. Overall, it's about our identity. What are we trying to convey to other people, but also probably to ourselves? Fashion, I think, is also... Oh, God, I didn't want to show you that one just yet. Fashion is also, I think, a commentary on the body. Now, this slide doesn't necessarily illustrate it too well, but certainly when I'm working in the hospital with people who have eating disorders, clothing becomes an incredibly important part of their illness. So generally speaking, anorexics will wear incredibly baggy clothes because they want to hide partly from the world, partly from the responsibilities of the world, and partly they want to hide that body from you. Of course, by hiding it from you, on some level they're hiding it from themselves. So there's quite an interesting dance that's going on there, where the clothing becomes very much a signal to their inner distress. If you think, for example, about girls on Towie, on The Only Way is Essex, and the way in which every single scrap of flesh is really out there for you to see. All the clothing is quite tight and very exaggerated. It's incredibly visible. That the statements they want to make about themselves are very visible, whereas an anorexic is really trying to hide from the world and is hoping to co-opt their clothing into that process. So I think that's why I find the idea of fashion and clothing a really interesting bellwether in terms of someone's mental well-being. If we accept that choosing the clothes that we do on some level affect our mood, what does it say if you only wear black every single day, even when it's 30 degrees outside? What does it say if, but it's okay in the UK actually because the weather changes so much, so you can leave the house at 7 o'clock and think it won't be sunny, and of course it is, so I'll buy you that one. But not every day. If you do it for 2 weeks, then I start to worry. If you come to the clinic and you come every day and you're wearing the same clothes every day, you haven't changed. What does that tell me about your mood, about your sense of well-being, about your sense of self-worth? Sometimes the clothes that people choose to wear can be a very interesting indicator as to how they are feeling about themselves. And obviously it's part of my job to pay attention to that, to pay attention to what's coming into the room, not just what they say, but how they present. If someone, for example, came to me and they were very depressed, but somehow they managed to have this incredible exterior, which is really refined and elegantly groomed, but actually inside they're in pieces, that too can often be quite a good clue that somehow they're wedded to the mask that they've created and they're terrified of letting that go. So it's just the ways in which, just to give you an insight as to how sometimes I use the external clothing, just to give me a bit more of an idea of to how someone is feeling. Again, if we're to put forward this argument that what you wear affects your mood, I think you only have to really think back to anecdotal evidence from World War II, for example, a time of, obviously great danger, deprivation, rationing. Those were the times when women would daub their legs in diluted coffee and draw pencil lines up the back of the calves in order to mimic hosiery, because to have gone to that effort was something that they felt very strongly about in terms of being able to carry on. They weren't going to be diminished by what was happening around them. It was very important for them to put on a brave face and say, no, I'm gonna look the best I can, despite the fact that we haven't seen nylons for 6 years or whatever. So again, a very important part of our psyche that suggests that we want to look the best we can be most of the time, which is why I then did want you to see this, because this is where I wasn't looking at my best. I'm second from the left. I've just been game viewing in Botswana and it completely peed down with rain. So sometimes obviously you just have to accept that you're not going to look your best and deal with it. But by and large, it would be quite nice if we could look the best we could be. I think I will get away from that one. Studies have shown that to carry on with that theme, people with disabilities will often use fashion as a way of normalizing themselves. When they feel that they aren't like everyone else, they will try to use fashion as a way of saying, but you know what, I can actually join in with this bit. I can wear that flamboyant scarf, or I can have that incredibly attractive jacket. I can become known for the person who always has a great pair of trousers or whatever it is. women who've had mastectomies. Some women are very affected by what has happened to their bodies, and they shrink from what has happened. But other women want to say to the world, no, actually, I'm quite proud of what I've been through and I've survived it. I don't really mind if I wear a low-cut dress that shows a bit of my scar, or that shows that I've actually been through something and survived. So fashion could actually be used to channel that kind of survivor experience, so that people know that they can embrace fashion to help them feel good about themselves, irrespective of what they've had to go through. That again is one of the reasons why I'm a very sort of positive person on behalf of the fashion industry. I think really fashion is about saying there's something bigger than me out there, and I can choose to join in if I want to. It might take a lot of work. I have to confess that I don't particularly feel ultra fashionable, but I'm interested in it as an industry, and I don't want to close myself off from it. It's a form of engagement that I actually do want to make. That, I guess, brings me to an area which can be a little bit awkward. The fashion industry is sometimes accused of being a little bit too aggressive, that somehow you've got to look a certain way. And I think that is one area of concern. It's not necessarily the fashion industry's fault, but as a race, as a species rather, we have a tendency again to rather alienate the people who aren't like us, who aren't part of our tribe. And actually, I've asked my husband's permission for this anecdote, but don't think too badly of him. When we were at university, he thought, oh, well, okay, I know what people are wearing. I can see what it is. They're wearing brogues, because we went to university a long time ago, so that's what people wore at university. And he bought some brogues, but they were the wrong colour, they were the wrong shade of brown, and he was just completely ostracised. You know, he showed himself up to be an imposter, and I loved him anyway, but he showed himself up to be an imposter in that one moment when people are saying, no, you can only look this particular way. And that's not the industry's fault, but I think it's worthwhile, those of you that are in that industry, to know that's the danger with human beings, that we tend to have that tendency. I remember, for example, going shopping a couple of years ago, and all I saw in the shops was smocks. And in my view, you kind of have to look a certain way to be able to get away with a smock. And it's not me. You have to be, I think, quite young and probably vaguely Scandinavian, Heidi looking, and so I missed out on both those counts. So it was something that I elected not to join in with. But I remember that summer thinking, so what am I going to buy? And I felt a little bit sort of deflated. And if there isn't enough out there, then that could make me feel quite excluded. I chose not to buy my smock, but there wasn't that much else. So maybe the fashion industry, again, it's about diversity and opportunity, because there are so many different identities that you're going to be seeking to meet. I came across some quite interesting research in America, and I actually just wanted to read a little bit out to you, not least because the language is quite complicated and I was a bit nervous about paraphrasing it. But it basically talked about immigrants to North America and the process of acclimatization and acculturation, if that's the right way of pronouncing it. And one of the studies said that people feel better disposed towards the dominant fashion of the country as their language skills improve, which I thought was quite interesting. And the other study said a slightly different thing, which said that there needed to be more intermediate offerings for people coming from one culture into another. Now, interestingly enough, these were studies looking at Muslim women who had come into North America, who ultimately would be quite keen to embrace the local culture, but they didn't feel that there was enough of a hybrid for them to make that transition. And as a result, they felt alienated from the fashion process. So just worth thinking about, really. The one area where I do get a little bit cross is a very glib media attitude which says, oh, it's the fashion industry's fault that young girls have poor self-esteem. I mean, that's pretty much what has been said quite stridently over the last 6 months. And I applaud Lynn Featherstone, the Lib Dem MP, who has created a pack for educating children in schools about some of the techniques in, for example, the magazine and newspaper industry in terms of things like airbrushing. So I think schools have a part to play in educating young girls about self-esteem issues, but I just don't think it's appropriate to lay the blame at the door of industries like the fashion industry. My view is that, yes, it would be much better if there were a greater variety of model sizes on the catwalk, and it would be better if airbrushing was eliminated. But I think we also have to recognize that the fashion industry is about fantasy, it's about play, it's about creativity. And that's why nobody should ever really be under any illusion that what you see on the catwalk is necessarily what everybody is expected to attain or mimic. That kind of education process can be carried out by parents, by schools, perhaps even by opening up this kind of lecture to school children, people in their final 2 years. I don't know, just that sense that the problem of self-esteem is a hell of a lot more than just about what happens within the fashion industry. Having said which, I think we have to recognize that, just want to check, no. If you have a vulnerability in this area about your own self-esteem, you will be affected by external images and external stories, because that is how human beings work. We soak up ideas. We are imitative creatures. We absorb and we mimic and we reject. We play around with what comes to us from our environment. Let's not lay the blame at the door of the fashion industry too severely. That's just not going to help matters. There are some people, though, who believe that if only they could get that pair of shoes or that particular Alexander McQueen outfit, if only they could have that Pippa Middleton's dress, whatever it might be, then their lives would be perfect. And my world is very much about dealing sometimes with people whose inner emptiness gets filled up by an obsession with something like fashion. Please don't try to tell me that that is the fashion industry's fault. I know you don't, but I'm very conscious that that happens quite a lot. It's too easy to say, oh, well, that's because they make these very seductive clothes, and no, it isn't. There are people out there who unfortunately do have issues around who they are and how they live their lives, and they project a lot of those insecurities onto fashion. They imagine that fashion could perhaps try and fill them up in some way. It's not necessarily something that you, if you're operating in that industry, need to worry about too much or to be overly concerned about. But that is sometimes a byproduct of the industry that you know and you love. So to conclude, because I would rather like to hear what all of you have to say as well, I think it would be fair to say, I don't know if this is going to work, fashion contributes to our sense of self very strongly. It also influences how other people see us, either just because of what we look like externally or because of this aura that we might give off. It could be an aura of confidence, it could be an aura of aggression if it's, very gothic, I don't know, actually that was a bit unfair. It could be a different persona that you're putting out there simply because of the clothing choices you make. It is worth remembering that fashion plays a good, strong part in our self-esteem. But don't be under any illusion. Fashion is primarily about fantasy. Thank you very much.
Lucy, thank you indeed. As Lucy said, I'm anxious to hear what the reaction from the audience is. So, any questions for Lucy, please? My job is in the skincare industry, and I've been asking myself for at least 3 or 4 years now what the connection is between skin and clothing is, and indeed hair, and the things we do to skin. We pierce it, and we tattoo it, and what is the established understanding about the single ornament, the connection between all these things that we show to the outside world?
It's very much, again, it's about identity and standing out on the basis that actually once we're naked, we could all, in effect, look pretty much the same. If you could change the colour of your hair or have a transplant or pierce your nose, suddenly it gives you a more distinctive look, one that might be memorable, one that might put people at a distance, or one that might lure people in. Sometimes that effect is unconscious. You're not necessarily aware of the effect that you're having on other people, and sometimes it's quite calculated. So yes, tattoos, piercings, for example, very generally are often viewed to be quite aggressive statements. Notwithstanding the pleasure that you can give by having a tongue stud, there is some sense in which you're doing something slightly controversial. Although I have to say that just in the last 5 years, tattoos and piercings have undergone a shift, because there's so much more, so many more, let's say, celebrities are having quite sort of tasteful or unthreatening forms of body adornment. So that's slightly changed. But above all, whether it's dyeing your hair, cutting your hair, this is why so many people have their hair cut after major life events, getting married, getting divorced, or getting a new job. I mean, those are the absolute classic moments where someone goes, male or female, will go in and say, I just want to do it differently. It's about, identity, sometimes about reinvention, but it's about who you are and making a statement.
I don't quite understand the last slide, the fantasy. So I've always said fashion is about people's dreams and aspirations.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of said a thing about tribe membership and things like this.
Yeah.
What do you mean by fantasy?
Fantasy, very similar, just playing around with ideas where your fantasy could be about an aspiration to a different kind of lifestyle or a different kind of you, or it could just be about something that's innate in you. So the girl on the left is sort of something quite primitive. I'm assuming it's a slightly Flintstonian thing, but it's about sort of a much more primitive edge. And of course, what would happen with none of that would be seen on the high street, but elements of it would, whether it's a dress that's in a print that is recognisably Flintstonian or something that's recognisably ethnic. People are playing around with an idea of who they are. Am I the kind of person who's a little bit wild? Am I the kind of person I want to give the impression that I go on long overseas holidays and therefore I can afford this kind of thing? It's all about the kind of, the dreams that you have about yourself and the permission to play around with those dreams. Fashion gives you the opportunity to do that, and also in a way gives you some templates to experiment. Hi.
Just a small question, really. You mentioned something about wearing black, and I just thought I would mention that most people who are in fashion professionally wear black.
And so what's that about? What would you say that was about? Because it's easy, but safety in what way?
I just wonder what you made
Well, when you say to me safety, that immediately to me sounds like someone who doesn't want to stand out, who kind of wants to blend in.
I mean, I think it's a currency that's very recognisable in the fashion industry. I think to remain sort of aloof, perhaps, to the winds of fashion in some way.
Right.
I'd be interested to throw that open to this audience as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting point because it used to be only related to age or mourning dress, but obviously it became adopted by fashion as a sort of standard dress. If you only have to think of Yohji Yamamoto, for instance,
Yeah.
and also other sort of celebrities and Miles Davis, or people who just have a uniform, but they don't change. It might change subtly because we all know you can have 50 shades of black as well. So I just wondered how you might respond to that.
Well, I guess like a lot of my work, I can make lots of generalizations, but ultimately when I'm working with one person in the room, it's their own pertinent experience. So for maybe a lot of people, it would be this idea of safety. But for other people in the fashion industry, they might regard black as a template, as a sort of the blank canvas onto which they could project something a little bit more distinctive, a little bit more individual. And I might not necessarily know which it would be for you or 3 other people in the room until I'd had a longer conversation. I think I was thinking more in terms of people who come into my consulting room and who are dressed at odds with everything else around them. Their career suggests that they would be in quite sort of bright clothes, but somehow they're wearing black, or they're wearing it every day. It's usually about the context with that kind of case. It's about saying, okay, so what's distinctive about this?
I suppose in a way, as you say, they're trying to mask any sort of reading through having perhaps that's one of my thoughts is that it would just be, as you say, it becomes a uniform rather than anything else.
I see it very much as a sort of hiding place. So there's very little to latch onto. Yeah, thank you for that though.
Lucy, you did mention how you use clothes for, let's say, diagnostic purposes for your patients. Is there the other way around for it? Do you use clothes for therapy? Is that possible?
I'm not quite sure I understand.
Do you, for example, recommend something to them once you notice black every day?
Oh, I see. Oh, well, interestingly, I mean, my style of therapy, my orientation, we're very blank. We don't really recommend anything at all. In fact, we're not really encouraged to speak very much at all. You're very lucky to hear my voice at all. But I have to say that phenomenologically, if somebody came in and had changed, let's say they are normally all dressed in black and then suddenly they come, wearing this yellow tie or whatever, I would mention that. I would use that as a departure for the conversation. So you're in a way, that's almost what you're doing, because you're drawing attention to it. You're noticing that something has changed, that there's something different being brought into the room. I just think because we all wear clothes, it's very easy to imagine that clothes don't really mean very much, particularly within the consulting room. But actually, I find clothing. Sometimes the patient will comment on the fact that they will comment on my clothes a lot, either as a sort of defense against talking about themselves, or because they're very curious, because in that very intense therapy way they want to try and emulate me, which clearly, obviously my dress sense is not really worth emulating, but in therapy terms there is that sense in which, I want to be like the teacher, I want to be like mummy. So it just provides a wealth of material without them actually even having to say anything at all. In fact, it's often the patients who say very little where you're actually trying to find out about them in another way, and clothes are an absolute gift in that sense. Hi.
I agree that fashion is not guilty about the situation of low self-esteem. But I would like to know your opinion about the democratization of luxury, because now the luxury brands have made sunglasses, perfumes, and all of these products so people can have part of the fantasy. So what do you think of this revolution of luxury?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because as you say, they make certain aspects of their brand much more affordable. So again, you think you can sort of buy into the brand or the lifestyle, the sort of fantasy image just by buying a pair of sunglasses as opposed to a whole set of luggage or a whole outfit. Again, I think there's a very compelling argument to say that that's a very healthy part of the fashion industry, because again, it almost becomes an affordable treat if you can obviously afford some of the really high-end fashion. But it's about saying, yeah, you can play with this identity, play with yourself, play with that notion that you're part of a tribe. Where I worry, I guess, is, I mean, it's a bit like social media, really. If you focus too much on that particular brand as a somehow representative of the whole of you, then you cut yourself off from a sort of much more rounded, much more authentic identity. In the same way as if you only communicate with people by Twitter or Facebook, then you're missing out on the wonderfulness of real human interaction. So again, that's why it would, I don't know if there's a phrase for this in the fashion industry, but in terms of people cherry picking different things from different houses, different sources, I'm much more encouraged by that approach to fashion rather than a rather slavish devotion or fixation on one particular thing. So I actually like the idea of a little bit here and a little bit there. That's right. It's very much about that. Yeah.
The rest is, false hair, false nails, false breasts, false skin colour, and I just wonder where you feel, you mentioned Italian, Essex and all those sorts of things. Why do you think that we've latched on to this so much as a contemporary culture?
I think it's quite a complicated picture, but in essence, I'm quite old-fashioned, and I think that it starts in the home. Everything starts in the home. And it's about the way in which the grown-ups respond, because the children are really only mimicking the grown-ups. They're overhearing conversations and they're picking up certain ways of being in the world. You're absolutely right. You've got those magazines that castigate people in the public eye for daring to put on a pound, when in fact, frankly, that's just almost normal daily behaviour. You're not the same weight in the morning as you are at the end of the day. But I think if there's a good solid bedrock of self-worth being nurtured within the home, it's a lot easier to then later explore ideas of self-worth and some of the things that come up in the magazines within that family nexus. Now, I think we also have to recognise that nobody has the perfect home, nobody has that perfect family life. And that's where schools can play a part, and that's why I mentioned the thing that Lynn Featherstone has put together. I think it is largely coming from, we are always a very visual culture. This is our fixation. Our fixation at the moment is on looking a particular way. And the problem is, 'twas ever thus. You only have to really look at all the paintings from the 15th century. Everyone's wearing the same clothes. You only have to look at what people were looking like in the 1920s. So that is probably, that aspect of it is not going to change. What can change is a nurturing of our children, male and female. And I'm so pleased you mentioned men as well, because 1 in 10 eating disorder sufferers are male. This is a very big issue, and it kind of has to start very early on, whereby you encourage small children to believe in themselves, irrespective of what they look like. The problem is, and we're all guilty of it, we will comment about our own looks, our own, thinning hair, or put on a pound, or, oh my, I can't believe it. And you don't realise that actually small children are hearing this. So I think it's quite a complicated picture, but in essence, if we could go back to instill good self-worth in our children, that's going to help them in the future to look at a copy of Grazia or whatever it might be, and to see it for what it is, which is just a piece of ridiculous journalism. Hope there's no one here from Grazia. Sorry, it's completely shot my career there.
Situation they'd rather not be in the first place. I mean, can you comment on how far you think fashion is a societal mirror? Has there ever been any research done? That's a question actually to the audience as well. I'm trying to link what's going on in the world to what is it being expressed in fashion and in clothing and in textiles.
I'd have to confess that I'm not as well genned up on the research, but you're right that certainly after World War II, which was an episode of deprivation, suddenly when the new look came in, that sense of almost the luxury of having these amazing skirts, where people wanted to prove to themselves that they had survived something and that they had that they hadn't lost their spirit. That it kind of, certainly in the UK, the deprivations after World War II were on some level even worse than they'd been during World War II, and yet this was the moment where people were saying, no, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. And certainly in the beauty industry, in terms of women, I think sales of foundation have definitely held up in this most recent 2 or 3 years of recession. And in previous recessions, the research has shown that sales of lipsticks have held up. That actually people almost intuitively understand that to give themselves a treat in hard times is very important for our ongoing well-being. And again, it doesn't have to be a huge outlay, a huge expenditure, but just to, in inverse proportion to what people are going through, I think there must be research out there that demonstrates, yes, that it reflects both the good things and the negative things that are happening in society. Almost as if you can imagine, obviously, that clothes on some level originally came into being as forms of protection, to sort of protect those most vulnerable parts of our body, then why wouldn't you, at times of stress or strife, turn to your covering to help make you feel a little bit safer or a little bit more secure in the world? But if anyone's got any research, I'd love to know about it. Thank you.
Anyone in the audience comment on that?
And then somebody was saying that apparently the sales of spandex have gone up at the moment.
I saw that.
Yeah. And that's to do with people being able to buy something quite cheaply that makes them feel good about themselves, which also obviously allows them to change their body shape without having to do lots of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Any last questions? In which case, thank you so much for
Pleasure.
sticking around.
Thank you.